hand over to you. Thanks. Brilliant. Well, I don't know what you think is going to happen. I've been asked to speak for 30 minutes on the proof of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I don't know if your first thought is, what is he going to say? I mean, Christians just have faith in it, don't they? There's no evidence, there's no proof. I wonder if you kind of think, this man's got nothing to say. How's he going to say nothing for half an hour? Well, you've got a handout, I've got a few things to say. And I would encourage you, please scribble on it, please make sure you've got one in front of you, please, underline the annoying bits, cross out the bits you disagree with, please engage with it. And then please do feel free to ask questions. It's really important to us that this is a give and take. So you get a lot from me, and then I have to submit to the same amount back from you. That's fair, isn't it? So you'll listen to me, then I'll listen to you, and then we can all just disagree politely with each other. I think it's fair to say that scientists find it difficult to look at history. A lot of times when I talk to scientists, which I used to do a lot in Imperial, people would say history's myth. Historians can believe anything, history can say anything. So I want you to try and remember that what we're doing today is it's not meant to be a science lecture, we're trying to look at history. And I want to introduce that concept by thinking about urban myths. Do you all know about urban myths? Or the idea of myths and legends. In England there's this kind of mythical person, King Arthur. The Sword in the Stone, the Disney film. And he's a myth. He's a legend. You might have heard of Robin Hood. Recently made famous by the Tobin tax, the Robin Hood tax, tax the rich to give to the poor. And the problem with a legend or a myth is you don't know when they really happened. Did anyone here go for Oxbridge? I tried to apply to Oxbridge. And there's all those kind of urban myths about Oxbridge interviews, aren't there? So the idea that as you go into the interview, and the guy interviewing you sits down, opens a newspaper, leans back at his desk and says, "Impress me." And the story goes that someone just got out their cigarette lighter and set fire to the paper. It's an urban myth because no one knows who did it, no one knows when they did it, no one knows where they did it, okay? So a myth is exactly that. The questions are who, where and when. But with Jesus, we do have lots of answers to who, where and when. For example, even without the Bible, even without any Christian input at all, here's some stuff we know about Jesus. He was a Jewish teacher who claimed to be God, and he taught that he would depart and return. Many people believe that he performed healings and exorcisms. Some even believe that he was the Messiah, the promised king from the Old Testament. His followers were called Christians. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius in Judea. Despite a shameful death, his followers believed that he was still alive, and that belief spread beyond Palestine, so there were multitudes of Christians in Rome by AD 64. All kinds of people from cities and countryside, men and women, slaves and free, worship him as God. We know all that without the Bible. So Jesus is not an urban myth or a legend. We can answer the who question, we can answer the where question, we can answer the when question. Let's look at the outline then of some evidence about Jesus' resurrection. Here we are, here's the main piece of evidence from the Bible. I'll just put it down there, let me read it out for you. This is St. Paul speaking. What I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and by the way, if the Romans knew how to do anything, they knew how to kill people. Yeah? I mean, Romans did kill people across the whole of the known world at that point, so let's assume they could kill people. He died and was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers, that just means Christians at the same time. Imagine if they were all brothers, that'd be one heck of a mother, wouldn't it? So they're all brothers, they're Christians, most of whom are still alive. So you can go and ask them, though some have fallen asleep, that is, they died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, he appeared to me also. That's the one I normally do. That just means I'm a bit unusual. Okay, there's some evidence from the Bible. I've then got 10 pieces of evidence for you. 10 pieces of evidence for Jesus' resurrection, numbered 1 to 10. First of all, the New Testament dates. So Jesus' death and resurrection around 30 to 36 AD. We know it must be before 36 AD, because that's when Pontius Pilate stopped being the governor. And even the non-Christians tell us that Pontius Pilate is the one who ordered him killed. St. Paul was converted between 33 and 36 AD. We know that because of the histories of Rome. So it's probably got to be before 33 AD. And so on. So we can work it out. So let's say 33 AD. He dies. That passage in 1 Corinthians, that passage in the Bible, was written in 44 AD. That's 11 years. 11-year gap. Now, I know that for you, 11 years is over half your life. But for many people, 11 years actually isn't that long. I can remember things that happened 11 years ago very clearly. I know you think that by the time you're 35, you're pretty much past it and bits of you start falling off. But let me tell you, I disagree with you on that. We might disagree on other things as this talk continues. I can remember things very clearly from 11 years ago. And Paul says, look, he appeared to 500 people. Many of them are still alive. Go and ask them. 11-year gap. Mark's Gospel, late 50s AD. Luke's Gospel, early 60s. Matthew, late 60s. John, AD 80 approximately. Certainly before AD 81. And I put where they find the accounts there. And in those accounts, you have a claim to eyewitness testimony. So what year is it now? 2012. So we're only talking about something that happened in 2001. Now I know that all that happened in 2001 for you is that you got out of nappies. But for me, 2001, I was a maths teacher. My football team were undefeated in national competition for 18 months in 2001. That's quite cool, right? I was their coach. That's pretty cool. Okay? And I remember it. And I'll happily tell you all about it afterwards. I can describe the goal we conceded in the game that we lost to break our 18 months. Of course I can. Of course I can. It's a pretty big thing, isn't it? To go undefeated. I can happily describe with some detail stuff from 11 years ago. And in fact, I could probably give you some eyewitnesses to it as well. So the New Testament dates are very close to the events. That's encouraging. The New Testament writers, who wrote it? Well, Paul, he wrote 1 Corinthians. That same Paul, he wrote, a third of the New Testament. Mark, who wrote Mark's Gospel, he travelled with Peter. And Peter was the senior apostle. One of the 12 apostles, 12 disciples. Luke was an educated man. Luke was a doctor. He starts his account by saying, many people have written accounts of what happened, but I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. One of the most highly educated men of his time. And he says, I have personally investigated everything from the beginning. Matthew and John were part of the disciples. So they're written early. They're written by people who knew what they were talking about. Thirdly, of course, one of the greatest things I think about the gospel accounts is that they all disagree. I think it's a real strength that they disagree on stuff. My father was a maths teacher, and he once awarded a mark of 210% for a piece of homework. Anybody here ever scored 210% in their homework? Come on, you're Imperial, you're meant to be clever. Anyone ever managed that? Do you know what happened? This chap had done his homework. He lent it to two of his mates. They copied it out absolutely identically. They'd made all the same mistakes. And so my dad thought it's only fair to give all those marks to the guy who actually did the work. So the other two guys got naught, and Dad gave this guy 70% 3 times. So you've done so well, I'm going to give you a commendation. Please go and see your head of year and explain to him how you got this great commendation. Now, as a teacher, if everybody does exactly the same thing, it's really obvious that they've just copied each other. Some of you are probably reliving parts of your GCSE years right now. It's really obvious. If everything they say, both positive and negative, is identical, of course you don't take it seriously. So I think the divergence of the gospel accounts is an encouragement that they're real, true, human accounts of what happened. We'll come back to those things later on. The disagreements are over things like how many angels were there? Was there 2 angels or just 1? The disagreements are not over things like, did Jesus rise from the dead? They're over comparatively minor things. We can come back to that if you'd like to. Fourthly, women were the main witnesses. Now back then, if you wanted to do a hoax, if you wanted to make something up, you would never use women as witnesses. Women were treated pretty horribly back then, I'm sure we all know that. For example, the testimony of a woman was worth half of the testimony of a man. So then, you needed 3 women in a court of law to outvote a man. 2 women equaled 1 man legally. I mean, it's abhorrent, by the way. I think that's a ridiculous thing. It's an awful thing. But it's true. So if you wanted to create a hoax, why would you have women as your primary witnesses? You just wouldn't do that back in those days. Fifthly, Look at these different appearances Jesus made. When you put all the Bible's appearances of Jesus together, including some of those I've put there in 1 Corinthians, this is what you get. He appears to Mary, he appears to the other women, he appears to 2 believers on the road to Emmaus, he appears to the 11 remaining disciples. Remember, Judas has killed himself. Then he appears to 10 of them without Thomas, then the 11 again with Thomas. Do you remember doubting Thomas? Doubting Thomas said, I won't believe unless I can put my hand in his side. Then to 7 of them out fishing, then to 11 again twice more, then to 500 people. So we're not talking about one appearance. We're talking about loads of appearances. Sixthly, we've got some pretty strong non-Christian attestation for the resurrection. Not just for Jesus' life, but even for the resurrection. For example, in AD 40, Caesar, I think he doubled or tripled the penalty for grave robbing. No historian has any clue why. There's nothing in the records. No one knows why. What a historian should look for, of course, is a grave robbing that annoyed the known world. A grave robbing that caused a load of chaos for the Romans. Can anybody here think of a particular empty grave that might, I can't prove it by the way, but might have so annoyed Caesar that he had to triple the penalty for it? No historian can ask that question. Just a pointer, isn't it? Then you've got Roman sources, Tacitus, his famous history of ancient Rome. He records the growth of the early church. He even records the fact that Pilate is the man who sentenced Jesus to be crucified. Pliny, Suetonius, these are mainstream Roman historians. Then Josephus. Now Josephus is quite a cool guy. Who here has seen Gladiator, the film Gladiator? Have you all seen Gladiator? So think of Marcus Aurelius, think of the gladiator man, okay? Josephus is him, right? He was a general. He was a big warrior. Not at all a Christian. I mean, he probably killed quite a few Christians, right? And he wrote, I think it might be over the page for you. He wrote this. Just skim read it, halfway down. He appeared to them on the third day, living again, as the prophets foretold. Now, it's not a simple quotation. There's some scholarly debate about whether every single word was written by Josephus. I read up on that a few years ago. The last PhD I could find was written by someone who I'm not sure, I don't think is a Christian, from Cambridge University, says it's all original. So there is some debate about that, but as far as I can work out, at the moment, historians believe it's true. Number 7, the disciples died. You would never die for a lie that you knew to be a lie. It's understandable that their followers might die. It's understandable that people from all sorts of religions die for things that may or may not be true nowadays. But if you were the original instigator, you started this bit of a gag, let's just see if we can get away with this whole resurrection thing. When they say to you, we're going to kill you, isn't that the moment when a gag stops being a gag? But these people died for it. Why would you die for something you knew not to be true? 8thly, the growth of the early church. Historians really struggle to explain how the early church grew so quickly. I mean, it's astronomical. And again, that's not relying on the Bible, that's just normal history. So as a scientist, you need to come up with an explanation for the growth of the early church. It's just a fact. Number 9, the New Testament's very reliable. When we quote Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, when we quote 1 Corinthians, we're not talking about ancient texts we have no evidence for. Have a look at these stats here. Earliest New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus, 300 AD. Earliest complete gospel, early 200s. Earliest fragment, early 100s. I've put some things down there. Thucydides, written 5th century before Christ. Earliest copy, 900 AD. That's a pretty big gap, right? How many copies have we got? Only 8. Caesar's Gallic Wars, written in the 1st century before Christ. Earliest copy, 900 AD. 10 copies. Tacitus Annals, written 1st century AD. Earliest copy, 1,000 years later. 20 manuscripts. How does the Bible stack up? 1st century AD. Earliest copy, 2nd century AD. 5,000 copies of the manuscript in its original form. And if you start including translations, that number's 20,000 before we've got a single of the other copies of anything. 20,000 manuscripts before 900 AD. Scientists will often say to me, look, if you want to prove the resurrection, you need extraordinary proof. That is extraordinary proof. That is extraordinary. Tenthly, the reliability of transmission. You know, this idea that the Bible is Chinese whispers and all these people copied it out, and how can you trust something that's copied out by 1,000 people? Answer, the scribes thought they were copying down the word of God. They weren't blogging. They weren't telling a story about their mate in the pub. They thought they were copying out the very words of God. How careful are you going to be? And actually, we've done quite a lot of research on the scribes. We can tell you about the different scribes. We can tell you a bit about their character. We can look at the scribes in Alexandria. We can look at the distinction between the copies that were made in the western and the eastern end of the Mediterranean. People have done a lot of work on it. So it's not Chinese whispers. I think there's 10 reasons then that you can believe in the resurrection. All sorts of reasons. Bible reasons, logical reasons, non-Christian historical reasons, all sorts of reasons. Let's think of some objections. I think I've put a few down, about 6 objections. And then you can come up with your own. You're very welcome to ask whatever you like. Oh, you're with me so far, by the way. Is this all making sense? Going too quickly, going too slowly? Making sense? Good. Okay, first of all, the objection is miracles are impossible. Well, some of you were there last night, so you're talking about miracles and science. Who was there last night, just so I know? I don't want to recover everything, so some of us were there last night. Obviously, we need to be a healthy sceptical. I'm not the sort of person that wants to believe in miracles left, right, and centre. I'm a mathematician. Mathematicians don't really get taught to just believe in miracles willy-nilly. I find it interesting when I talk to scientists about miracles, however. I had a debate with a published author about a month ago. He was selling his book in Waterstones, and he said, would I like to buy a copy of his book? I said, would I mind if I asked him a few questions about his book? He's a scientist trying to disprove Christianity. We had a chat about it. He said to me, resurrection's impossible. It's utterly unscientific. You can't do it in a lab. If you can't duplicate it in a lab, I'm not going to believe it. If you can't peer review it, I'm not going to believe it. I said to him, brilliant, can I shake your hand? You obviously don't believe in the Big Bang. You can't do that in a lab. Has anybody ever done the Big Bang in a lab? Has anyone ever peer reviewed the Big Bang? I said to him, come on mate, be a scientist, be real. Do you believe in the Battle of Waterloo? Can you replicate that in your lab? Maybe you do. Maybe you guys just don't get on very well and you get your cannon out. I don't know. Maybe I should go and do something. I did maths, we didn't have any labs. We just had really boring kind of sitting around drawing 17-dimensional graphs. And our conversation carried on, and about 5 minutes later, the same scientist who's just made the kind of resurrection's impossible argument said to me, oh, but of course, in the history of the world, we know of at least 200 people who were dead and then lived again. Well, make your mind up. Be scientific. Either it's impossible or it's happened 200 times. Which one? And if it's happened 200 times, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? So I don't know what your objection is about resurrection, but Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding is the kind of massive text. So if you do disbelieve in miracles, full stop, presumably that Hume is either the thing that you've read to believe that miracles don't happen, or it's behind the people you've read to believe miracles don't happen. He makes 2 arguments. He makes an argument on the uniformity of nature, and he makes an argument on the uniformity of experience. Funnily though, he says nature's uniform. In another book he says we don't even know whether the sun will rise tomorrow. So I'm not sure that he's really sure that nature is uniform. If you really believe nature's uniform, then you're absolutely stone cold certain the sun will rise tomorrow, but David Hume isn't. In fact, he says it's the toughest question for himself as an atheist. He says, that's the one question I can't answer. Why is the universe uniform? I'm not sure it is. So he kind of denies himself on that one. Uniformity of experience, well that's a tough one, isn't it? Uniformity of experience. So the last 300 years show that kings and queens of England don't get beheaded. That's true, isn't it? But Charles I was beheaded. You can't disprove that by saying it hasn't happened for 300 years. There's a difference between uniformity of experience full stop and the general uniformity. And actually that's what defines a miracle, isn't it? That's what you need to define a miracle. The whole concept of miracles relies on the concept of normal. So when these fishermen in the boat said, wow, Jesus calmed the storm, that's a miracle, they're fishermen, right? They know what normal is. They've been in a few storms. So the argument that the New Testament times, when they believed in these miracles, they were pre-scientific, they were primitive. That argument doesn't run. They were better fishermen than you are. Okay? They knew Lake Galilee better than you do. They knew what storms did and didn't do. The whole scientific concept of normality is a basis for saying something's a miracle. If you don't have it, what do you mean by miracle? Does it make sense? But secondly, of course, the argument that understanding the laws of nature makes miracles impossible is a bonkers argument. And it's been shot out of the water 60 years ago, presumably you're familiar with it. C.S. Lewis says, you've got a drawer, you put £1,000 in. Next day, you go and put another £1,000 in. Laws of addition say you've now got £2,000. The next day, you put another £1,000 in. Law of addition say you've got £3,000. The next day, you put another £1,000 in. Law of addition says you've got £4,000. That's what laws of nature do. The next day, you go to your drawer, there's only £1,000 in it. What do? Do you say, oh no, the laws of nature have been broken? Miracle! Or do you say, there's a thief? You see, the laws of nature teach you to diagnose. The laws of nature tell you to dial 999, don't they? Do you see? So actually, understanding laws of nature enables us to discern miracles. They're necessary to the concept. They don't explain them away. They are necessary to them. So that's the miracles objection. What about science as the only means of knowledge? I won't ask how many of you believe that. If you do believe it, would you like to prove it? Feel free to write it down on a bit of paper and ask me a question time. If you want to believe that science is the only means of knowledge, prove it. Stephen Hawking tries to do so in his new book, The Grand Design. Do you know how he proves it? It's genius. A key sentence in that book is it's a monumental sentence for a scientist to say. The sentence goes like this. Philosophy is dead. So you take philosophy's pulse as a scientist, because that's what we're big scientists here, right? You take the pulse of philosophy and you discern that there is no pulse in philosophy. Is that what he means by it? The only other option is that he's doing philosophy. And doing philosophy to prove that philosophy is dead. Interesting. I'll leave that with you. Thirdly, the writers were biased. We shouldn't believe the New Testament evidence because they're obviously biased. I mean, it's being written by Christians, right? And if they believe what they're writing, they've got an inherent bias, so I'm not going to believe them. That's quite a common objection, I think, isn't it? I think this is sort of where we ended up last night, if I understand rightly. You know, multiple attestation for a miracle. You need multiple attestation for a miracle. Is that where we ended up a bit last night? But if the attestation is biased, what are you going to do? Well, first of all, you've got a lot of work to do on any history, haven't you? Let's imagine that all the writers who write about Caesar are biased. So you're going to stop believing in Caesar now. Let's imagine that all the writers who wrote about Alexander the Great are biased. Presumably they were. I mean, we're all biased, aren't we? Are you going to stop believing in Alexander the Great? Secondly, of course, when they heard about the resurrection, they weren't Christians. Believing in the resurrection is what made them Christians. So at the moment they heard it, they weren't biased. They were unbiased. In fact, they were probably biased against. They were pretty happy in their Jewish beliefs or whatever. Thirdly, and most importantly, I think this is a potentially very offensive argument. You've got to be really careful if you really start making the argument that you don't believe the testimony of people who are biased. Who are the best historians of the Holocaust? Who makes the best historian of the Holocaust? Who do you think? Well, obviously a Jew. A Jew is the best historian of the Holocaust. Why they care about it. And a Jew knows that their testimony is likely to be attacked. They know their testimony has got to stand up to rigorous evidence. So a Jew will never exaggerate by one dead body. A Jew will never exaggerate by 1 second. A Jew will never exaggerate anything on the Holocaust. Because they know people will take their testimony and try and take it apart. They will therefore guarantee that their testimony is utterly accurate and stands up to rigorous proof. Do you see? A Jew makes the best historian of the Holocaust. Who do you think makes the best historian of the resurrection then? The Christian bias actually is an argument for taking their view more seriously than others. Or you're in real trouble about Holocaust denial. And you shouldn't get a German to say that, because you'll be arrested. Fourthly, if proof or suspicion of bias implies you doubt their evidence, what are you going to do with people like Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins? We know they're biased. Presumably you doubt everything they say, and you should do, because you know they're biased. Fifthly, of course, you're biased. So you can argue with yourself about that. And you and yourself can have a really nice, interesting discussion about your bias. Let me know who wins. You need a healthy skepticism about yourself, don't you? You've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean when you get the 2 Jack Sparrows. That's kind of going on, isn't it? There we are. Number 4, D. The hearers were gullible. So the idea that pre-scientific age, they were pretty gullible back then. Really? Are fishermen famous for being gullible? I thought fishermen are pretty down to earth, aren't they? You know, say to a fisherman, I've seen a ghost. Oh, shut up. You know, what do you think fishermen are like? Matthew was a tax collector. Can you imagine tax collectors? They're not gullible, are they? Seriously, I haven't got the money this week. What does a tax collector say to that? Tax collectors are professionally not gullible, aren't they? Matthew wrote Matthew's Gospel. He's a tax collector. Secondly, there were loads of messianic movements around those times. Loads of people claimed to be messiahs, and none of them ever had their followers claim that they were alive after they died. It just wasn't an option. No one else, only Jesus. Thirdly, in those days, there was no expectation of resurrection. In Jewish thinking or writing, in Greek backgrounds, the idea of resurrection was mad. It was bonkers. It wasn't even there. It was just weird. Now, we have a concept of the afterlife. We have a concept of ghosts and things because we've been brought up on the Christmas Carol. And, you know, if someone says, oh, the ghost of Christmas past turned up on my door, you kind of, at least it's vaguely in your psyche, isn't it? Or you've seen films like The Sixth Sense, and, you know, that kind of exists in our worldview. It didn't exist in their worldview. Just out of nowhere. And that means that the resurrection appearances can't be hallucinations. Because a hallucination is a wish fulfillment. But nowhere in Jewish or Greek or Roman backgrounds is there any concept of resurrection. So how can the resurrection be wish fulfillment? They didn't wish for it. They had no concept of it. In fact, just thinking about the hallucinations, the number of different appearances, the diversity of appearances to men and women day and night, in the roads, in the rooms, in towns and countries, the no wish fulfillment. The Greek word used is ophthe, and that's the word they use for seeing. They had different words about visions. The Jesus who we meet in those resurrection appearances, he walks, he talks, he eats things. Thomas touches him. That's not a ghost. You know, the ghost of Christmas past, you know, you don't throw your right hook, do you? Well, what happens when you throw your right hook at the ghost of Christmas past? What happens? Well, the CGI is really dodgy and your hand sort of passes through and there's these kind of little crickly lines because, you know, CGI wasn't good in those days. Yeah? Isn't that what happens when you throw your fist at a ghost? But Thomas touches Jesus. He says, my Lord and my God. It's not a ghost, is it? What about the time gap? Well, we see the time gap's pretty small. 10 years, 11 years, and my great football team of 2001. It's not a very big time gap. But do you remember that back then, to be a rabbi, to be a Jewish rabbi, you had to memorize the whole Old Testament. Okay? You know how thick a Bible is. They're quite thick books, aren't they? That's 3/4 of the Bible. You had to memorize it word for word. Okay, so do you think they were any good at remembering stories accurately? There are African tribes even today where you can do a 1-hour talk and they can repeat it verbatim. Can you imagine being able to repeat verbatim everything I've said so far? And I've just done 20 minutes. And you guys are intelligent, right? You're an Imperial. Anyone wants to do verbatim? The only thing that can do verbatim is the video camera. But there's still tribes today, because they haven't got the recourse to paper, that have to do stuff that accurately. The reason that we don't have to do that is because it's all on the internet. You haven't got to remember things verbatim because it's all on Wikipedia. If you haven't got Wikipedia, you've really got to remember stuff. Do you see, I can tell stories about whatever I like, really, and I can sort of jazz the stories up a bit, because the true story is written down somewhere, or it's on video somewhere. But imagine you live in a culture where you don't have that. The only truth you've got is the stories told from generation to generation. That story matters. You're not going to change it, are you? That is your Wikipedia. Remember how many eyewitnesses there were? For example, in Mark's Gospel, he names Bartimaeus. Luke and Matthew had access to Mark's Gospel. When they wrote their accounts, they based them in part on Mark's Gospel. Why didn't they give Bartimaeus his name? And in Mark, he names Ruth and Alexandra, who are the sons of the man who carries Jesus' cross. Why doesn't Luke and Matthew do that? And why does Luke only name one disciple on the road to Emmaus? He says, I've carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Why only give one name? Answer. Asked all those questions if they're eyewitnesses. You name the people who are alive. Mark could name someone, but Matthew and John not give them a name because he's died. He's no longer useful as an eyewitness. There's there's a big argument to be made that the names of people in the Gospels are there as eyewitness testimony. Reinforces the strength of the argument, doesn't it? Second to last, the New Testament's unreliable, it's just a myth. Well, if it is a myth, it's a really weird way to write a myth. I mean, if you're going to write a myth, like if I'm going to write a myth about me, I'm going to end up as some kind of, I ripped my shirt open and I'm Superman. If you're going to write a myth about yourself, what are you going to make yourself look like? With the kind of amazing abs, which actually is true, and the kind of, that's what you do if you're writing a myth. So why talk about Jesus being born in Nazareth? That's like being born in Hull. Or Scunthorpe or something. With apologies to anybody from Hull and Scunthorpe. I'm not going to... Jesus was born of unmarried parents. In those days. Jesus was seen to be weak. He needed to sleep. He cried when his friend had died. The disciples got surprised. The disciples let each other down. The disciples were idiots quite regularly. If you're writing myth, why make yourself look a total muppet? If you have a secret blog and a secret identity, I bet you don't look like a total numpty. I bet you look rather clever. That's what you do if you're writing a myth, isn't it? Secondly, what is a myth? C.S. Lewis was a professor at Cambridge. He's an expert in what a myth is, and he wrote this. I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know that not one of them is like this. Of this gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, or else some unknown ancient writer in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. If it's untrue, it must be narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see this has simply not learnt to read. You see, if you want to call something a myth, do your work on myths. Describe to me what a myth looks like. Do some reading on myths. Read some myths. Lewis had read every myth out there. When someone describes John's Gospel as a myth, Lewis says, you don't even know what a myth is. Do you see? Interesting, isn't it? Thomas Arnold, Professor of Oxford, Specialist Roman History. I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proved by better or fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquiry than the great sign that God has given us, that Christ died and rose from the dead. Finally, the accounts are too diverse. Well, that's quite normal when you're doing history back then. So Hannibal crossed the Alps? My grandfather used to do this for me to try and keep me entertained. Hannibal used to cross the Alps with elephants. So he used to do his elephant across the Alps, and they kind of... It could be taken on by... it could be Manny, couldn't it, in Ice Age 4. The elephants would wobble on the Alps and stuff, and he used to do that, the elephant as well. Okay? It's just normal history that Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants. There's only two sources for it, Polybius and Livy. The dates are different, the routes are different. I mean, everything's different about those two sources. You can go and check them out. But no historian doubts that the thing really happened. That's just normal history. I've got loads of expert opinions there. You can have a read of them. Conclusion. Be scientific. Scientists need to follow the evidence. That's what it means to be a scientist, isn't it? You need to follow evidence. There's pretty good evidence for the resurrection. If the evidence is good, then you've got to construct a hypothesis. What about something like Jesus rose from the dead? And then you've got a real question, haven't you? I mean, what are you going to call someone who can walk around 3 days after their own brutal murder? They're more than human, aren't they? I think it's natural to believe that Jesus was God because he rose from the dead. If you want to take this further, there's a bunch of things you can do. There's this talk on Thursday night. You can ask questions in a second. I do want to commend this book. He's a math professor at Oxford, John Lennox. So if you've read something like Dawkins' The God Delusion, here is someone who's equally qualified responding. It's not very long. It's good fun to read. He's a mathematician, so he's got a brain. He's at Oxford, so he's got a big brain. And it's a really good book. I've been really enjoying it. He's kind of warm. He's got a bit of a sense of humour. He's Northern Irish, so he's a bit of banter. But I do recommend that. I put some other books down there as well. Why don't you take 2 minutes around your tables, have a chat, work out your question. I'll have a little drink, rest my voice, and then you can ask whatever you like. Firstly, very helpfully pointed out to me, if I wasn't clear about the whole resurrection ghost thing. There was no expectation of resurrection in their worldviews. They did have ideas of ghosts. So at one point in the Gospel, they see Jesus walking across the waterfall and say, oh, it's a ghost. I think that shows that the disciples are distinguishing in their heads between a ghost and a resurrected person. So if that confused you, I'm sorry. And if I've confused you even more, I'm even sorry. Here's my first question I've got. Thanks very much. Very good handwriting for scientists. So didn't the Jews believe in a coming Messiah? So surely there should be some expectation of resurrection. My understanding of that, the guy to read on that is Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, who's a historian. My understanding is that they had an expectation of Messiah, but they thought the Messiah was going to be a victorious warrior figure. So they didn't have a concept of a Messiah who was going to die and rise again, although you could argue that reading the Old Testament they should have. But they really thought the Messiah was going to be some warrior on a white charger who's going to slay the Romans and free the Jewish people. So their understanding of Messiah wasn't that he would die and rise again. You see that, don't you, in the way that when Jesus teaches those sort of things in the Gospels, he's greeted with skepticism. He says to the Jewish leaders, destroy this temple and I'll build it again in 3 days. And he's talking about his body, saying, destroy this and I'll build it again in 3 days. And if the Jewish leaders were expecting a Messiah who'd die and rise again, they'd have been like, oh right, is that you? Oh hi. And they don't. They mock him. So it seems, even from the New Testament, that they didn't have that expectation. Anyone want to come back on that? You're very welcome to come back on that. I'll repeat the questions so we can all hear. Another question here. Why wouldn't Jews exaggerate talking about the Holocaust? If a huge part of evidence had been destroyed, spoilers, etc., then it would be just their words against Nazis. Who the world will believe? The victims or the oppressed? I think the argument I'm trying to make is, so the argument you hear, let's back up. The argument you hear is, we can't trust New Testament evidence for the resurrection because they're biased. Okay? And I'm saying, I think their bias is why you can trust it. And my illustration is the Jews on the Holocaust. If a Jew was ever caught exaggerating anything on the Holocaust, let's imagine a Jew made a statement and some future evidence popped up, and the Jew was caught having made the exaggeration, what's going to happen then? So it's in the Jew's interest never to say anything other than stuff they know to be true. Now this question says, if it's a question of whose word against whose, that's a slightly different issue. And I would say that in that context, a Jew's only going to say what they think is true, in case in future evidence came up, okay? You know, imagine that one of the guards repented later in life and said, actually, this is what happened. We only killed that many, not that many. So the Jew's only going to say what they think is true. So the whole kind of, who do you believe when it's your word against mine is not what I was going for. It's more that a Jewish historian writing on the Holocaust is never going to write an extreme out there blog saying, actually it was this. Because that's going to discredit something that they believe in passionately. I would think that because they believe in it passionately, they're going to be just really clear on it. If you do come back on that, I'm very happy.
They might be right in what they believe, but that's not necessarily what's truly happening, because of the position they're in. What they believe might be exaggerated, so they're not purposely trying to lie, but they still might not be giving a true representation of what has happened.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I think that would go then back to one of my different arguments. So, for example, when St. Paul heard about the resurrection, he wasn't a Christian. You know, he was a Jew, he was persecuting Christians. So, something convinced him. You can't say at the moment that he heard about the resurrection, Paul was biased in favour of it. He wasn't, he was totally biased against it. You know, he was really famous as persecuting the Jews. He stands there at the first Christian martyrdom, which is in the book of Acts, chapter 7, the martyrdom of Stephen. So he's really famous for being anti-Christian. So the bias question doesn't come into when they first heard about the resurrection. You could argue, couldn't you, that having believed at that point, by the time he came to write 1 Corinthians, he was biased. But he claims eyewitness testimony. He claims 500 people. And that can't be a hallucination, because that's just not how hallucinations work. So what do you do with it? You know, medical experts on hallucinations, there might be some in this room, would just say that they don't work like that. You get individual hallucinations, you get wish fulfillment hallucinations. What you don't get is 11 different things in all these different contexts, for all these different people, over all those different weeks. Just don't do it. Or you could rely on miracle, and if you want to tell me you believe in miracles to explain the hallucinations, then we have a whole different conversation about resurrection, don't we? I don't mind if that's what we want to do. We can go around again. So come back up. Yeah.
Well, the question on the 500 people who saw this same thing, I don't know much about it, but how much evidence is there for that? Because if one person's written that 500 people saw it, that doesn't mean that much. Did the 500 people write about it themselves, or how much evidence is there for them actually seeing?
If by that do you mean, have we got any of their testimonies? Have we got the names of it? If the answer is no. What's interesting, I don't know, sorry, I'm just trying to get the right level of answer to that. The third book I wrote on the back, on Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, goes into that in loads of detail. Talks about writings of people like Papyrus, who's one of the very early kind of witnesses to what happened to the writings on the Gospels. So like, what happened to those really early copies of Mark's Gospel or 1 Corinthians? A guy called Papyrus. As I remember, he lived in one of the villages. There was a big junction, a big crossroads between all the trading routes. So lots of those tellers would come through here. And so that was the sort of place that would see these different things as they passed between different people. So he lived in a kind of Oxford circus for the known world. So a lot of the evidence for those 500 goes back to not just New Testament evidence, but goes back to the fact that if it's written in 44 AD, 11 years after the event, then you can just go and ask them. And I'm sorry, that could be a really technical answer. You can come talk to me afterwards if you want a really more technical answer. There's that book, it's 500 pages long, it's kind of PhD level. But he really engages tightly with all the kind of maybe slightly dubious stuff out there. And he's a senior professor at St Andrews in Scotland. Richard Bolton. He also engaged with the whole Jewish Holocaust argument, so you might enjoy it. It's a bit of a read though. There's not much colouring in. I always like colouring in. Hi.
I wanted to make a bit of a comment and then a question about that. You've been talking about, you've been talking about it from the scientific angle, and I appreciate that. But what I wanted to do is talk about what the Gospel says about it again.
What the Gospel says?
Well, what the Gospel says about the resurrection.
Yeah.
Because the first thing I wanted to say is that after his crucifixion, right, they never used the word he was resurrected. They all said he was alive, right? The disciples never said he was resurrected or anything like that. And secondly, we have to look at what Jesus actually said. And Jesus said he will give, we're talking about miracles, he said the miracle he'll show is the sign of Jonah, right? And he didn't say this is going to be 1 out of 10 miracles you're going to see here. He said this is the only miracle you're going to see, right? And the sign of Jonah is not of resurrection, it's of survival. Because if you throw a man in a raging sea, you expect him to die. If he dies, it's not a miracle. If he survives, it's a miracle. Then he gets gobbled up by a fish, right? He's spinning around for 3 days in the sea, right? And then he's praying to God inside that whale's belly. And obviously he's alive. And if you're inside a well, you expect to die, right? And then he's thrown back onto the shore. So that is a miracle called miracles, all right? You cannot say, because I know I was picking out the question, they say, well, the miracle is not that, the miracle is 3 days and 3 nights. Right? Well, in fact, the miracle is not 3 days and 3 nights, because Jesus was not in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, he was in there for 2 days and 1 night at the best. So that's what I wanted to say, the sign of Jonah is not a resurrection, it's a survival. And my other thing is, Jesus makes it quite clear that, his mission, he says, I've been sent for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he also says further, he says, I have other sheep which are not of this fold, and I must bring them to me, and they will listen to my voice, so that there's one flock and one shepherd. So he makes a very clear intention, and he makes an assertion that, yes, he's going to go to these lost tribes, okay, and what I wanted to know from you is what happened to his promise. Because if he was so-called resurrected, I believe it was revival, not resurrection. Okay, if he was revived or resurrected or whatever afterwards, what happened to his promise? Because he had to go and search for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And now, the lost sheep of the house of Israel, historically, they've been exiled away to the east. And they're in places like Tibet and Afghanistan, Kashmir, and things like that. And the tribes there who actually say, I'm descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. And they say Jesus came to us post-crucifixion, right? And there's no way they would actually claim this for generations after generations, right? Because
Okay, I think I've understood your question. Can I try?
Yeah.
I think I've given you a good long time to say the thing, so that's fine. No, it's fine. You had to listen to me for quite a long time, so you've been very patient. I'm doing my best. So 3 things. First one, they never use the word resurrection. That's okay. The Bible never uses lots of words. We just use them. By resurrection, I mean the man Jesus came back to life having been dead. I understand that you disagree with that, but I'm just clarifying what I mean by the word resurrection. That was your first thing. So the disciples and Jesus never used the word resurrection. Can I just clarify another thing? I never said 3 nights and 3 days. I said on the 3rd day. And that we're talking about the way they counted in those days. So they died on Friday, that's day 1. Saturday, resurrection on Sunday, it's day 3. So that's how they counted. I never said 3 days and 3 nights. So that's not how they. You just got to use the way they use language. Can I try and answer your questions?
No, but I'm just saying quickly, it says 3 days and 3 nights in the prophecy of Jonah, so that's why I was saying.
Okay. I'm about to come to Jonah, but I never made the claim that he was in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. I said he rose on the 3rd day, which is a biblical way of speaking. So that was the first thing, resurrection. By resurrection, I mean he died and he came back to life again. I think that's what we all mean by resurrection. If you type resurrection into Wikipedia, that's what they mean by resurrection. That's what I mean by resurrection. That's what my scientist meant by resurrection. Just what it means. Obviously, I'm talking in English, so I'm using lots of words they never used. You know, if I talked in Greek, I'd probably lose you. So I'm probably using loads of words the disciples never used. I can live with that. Second thing, about the only sign I'll give you is the sign of Jonah. He says that in Matthew 11. I think it's slightly unfair to say that's the only promise Jesus made about his resurrection, because as I quoted earlier, he said to the Jewish leaders, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it again in 3 days. So I think we should never read the Bible in a way that makes one verse disagree with another verse. Okay, that's a bad way to read the Bible. It's all written by God. Okay, through people. So to make the Bible disagree with itself is not a clever way of reading the Bible. Okay, so to say that the only promise Jesus made about the resurrection is that particular thing in Matthew 11 is not a fair thing to say. And you have to understand that geographically, don't you? Where is he geographically in Matthew 11 when he makes that statement? I believe it's Matthew 11. And who's he saying it to? Is he saying that to the whole world, or is he saying that to the specific people who are rejecting him? Actually, it's a sign of condemnation on those people. He's condemning them by saying it. Third thing is about the whole Jonah thing, isn't it? So Jonah's a story about a man, which I believe happened, about a man who goes into the sea, swallowed by a fish, comes out. So that man didn't die. I think if the question you're asking is, did Jesus really die? What I said earlier, I think is true. Romans knew how to kill people. If the Romans proved one thing over hundreds of years, it was that they could kill people. There's lots of things to say about that. I mean, if you ever saw the film The Passion of the Christ, anyone ever see that when it came out? You were all under 18 when it came out. But anyway, you can now see it legally, so if you ever see that, you know, one of the miracles is actually that Jesus got to the cross still alive. If you look at what he went through before he got to the cross. And then he's shut in this tomb for what? 36 hours? And the idea that he wasn't dead is, I think, personally, ridiculous. Not least because Romans knew how to kill people. Trying to think if I've engaged with everything you said. I didn't take notes. You had a 4-page handout for all the things I said. But resurrection, he was dead, he was alive again. Jonah, it's a picture. Oh, sorry, the John 11 stuff. John 10 stuff about different sheepfolds. Yeah, you've got to read that in the context of end of John 9, haven't you? Where Jesus is talking about the difference between Jews and Gentiles. And when Jesus says to Jews, I haven't just come for Jews, I've come for everybody, that's an amazing thing to say. He says, I haven't just come for Jews. Stop thinking you're so special. I've come for the whole world. That's brilliant, isn't it? And that's what Jesus is saying there. So I do think that John makes that very clear by the time you read the whole of John 9 and John 10, and not just those 2 or 3 verses in John 10. That's a longer conversation, it's not really to do with the resurrection. So we'll have that over coffee afterwards very happily. I'm just trying to focus on the resurrection. Have I made any sense in trying to come back on some of those things? I think the key thing is, what I mean by resurrection, what I mean is, he was dead, he lived again. Was he really dead? Yeah, Romans were good at killing people. Has anyone got a shorter question? Because my brain's beginning to go. If you've got a short question, you can ask it.
A nice short one.
Go on, go for it.
You say, when you talk about Mark naming people and then looking back, don't name people, you say, did you mean that when people are named, they are witnesses because they're still alive?
That's the argument Richard Borken's making. So, if you read Mark's Gospel, then read Luke's Gospel, what you'll find is that the first 10 chapters of Luke's Gospel read very like Mark. So it's really obvious that it's that copying thing I talked about. It's really obvious that Luke is looking sitting down, and one of the things he's done is he's got Mark in front of him. I mean, you'll see if you read Luke chapter 2 that he's done a bunch of stuff that Mark hasn't done. He's gone and talked to Mary, he's gone and talked to Elizabeth. So you get much more, in Luke you get much more about, sort of Mark really dives in a kind of year into Jesus' ministry. And Luke gives you more of the pre-stuff. Luke is a lot of the stuff you hear about at Christmas, about the angels and the shepherds and all that sort of stuff, which isn't in Mark's Gospel. So Luke's obviously done some extra research. But what you've got this weird thing that if Luke had Mark's Gospel in front of him, right, and Luke says, as a really educated man, I'm doing careful research, and Mark gives the name of people, why would Luke then just say a man, when Mark says it's called Bartimaeus? And when Mark says that the guy who carried Jesus' cross had sons called Ruth and Alexandra, why would Luke not write them? So that's the question that everyone's got to answer. And Richard Borken's argument is, and it couples with the C.S. Lewis quote, doesn't it? Richard Borken's argument is twofold. Number one, you don't do extraneous detail when you're writing stories in those days. So do you remember C.S. Lewis saying, look, either they invented modern novelistic literature, or it's just reportage. So you just don't do random names. You know, read other stuff from around those periods. You just don't do family history. It's not like 19th century novels. Who's ever read Les Miserables? You know, okay, so like 90 pages in, have you met anybody yet? You haven't met Marius yet, you haven't met Valjean yet. 90 pages in there. There was a man walking down a road from Paris to Lyon. You know the road from Paris to Lyon, don't you? And how as you go on that hedge, there's that gore, it just goes up, doesn't it? Do you remember? It just goes, and it just goes and goes and goes. It's talking about the inn and the bit, you know, that's not what they did back then. And it's frustrating when the French writers do it, because it's a great story hiding in the Miserables, and if you could just rip half a page out, it'd be a real page turner, wouldn't it? That's not what they did back then. They don't do extraneous details. So why have you got Ruth and Alexandra? Why? And then why, having got them, does Luke leave them out? Answer, I think, is it's eyewitnesses. Does that help at all? Sorry for the Les Miserables rant.
Maybe, but I don't know why just naming necessarily witnesses to be named all the time, even when people are dead.
But they didn't, that's the point. It's not you running it. They didn't. Yeah. So just, at the time, you just didn't name names. So why are they doing it? It's just, either it's 19th century novelistic literature, or they're putting names in for a reason. What's the reason? And once they're put in by Mark, and Luke's got access to Mark, why does Luke leave them out? The only thing I think that makes sense of both of those is eyewitness. Sorry, my rant about Les Miserables slightly didn't help, did it?